they once lived here. In the cold, silent dark of a limestone cave in southern France, where wind once howled through pale stone walls, now only bats and dust remain. But beneath the layers of rock and ash, something endures. Not a person, but their story. And it's ready to be told. 42,000 years ago, there was a man named Thorin. No one knew he ever existed until a single tooth rose from the soil. And with it, prehistoric history's greatest mystery, because where he died is where we begin. This is not just an excavation. It's the moment Neanderthals and Homo sapiens stood side by side under the same stone roof. A fleeting moment, but enough to rewrite everything we thought we knew. Welcome to Prehistoric Shadows, where DNA becomes destiny and silence becomes story. In the Rhone Valley of southern France, beneath a sun-bleached ridge of ancient limestone, lies a narrow, almost forgotten cave. The locals call it Mondragon, a name that once meant little more than a spot on a map. But to archaeologists, it has become something else entirely, a gateway to another world. For over 3 decades, teams from across the globe have returned here, season after season, chiseling through layers of compacted soil and ancient sediment. What they found was staggering. Tens of thousands of stone tools, shards of bone, flecks of charcoal, and the soot-stained remnants of long-dead fires. A prehistoric workshop, a graveyard, a home. But in 2015, Mondragon gave up a secret it had kept for more than 40 millennia. Deep in one of its lower chambers, buried beneath a layer of ash, a single jawbone surfaced. Thick, heavy, Neanderthal, and unlike most fossils, it still held viable DNA, genetic code suspended in time. Nearby were pieces of skull, finger bones, teeth, fragments of a once living person slowly returning to light. After 42,000 years underground, it wasn't just a discovery, it was a resurrection. A voice as silent for an age suddenly had something to say, and it would change everything we thought we knew about who walked this land before us. Mondragon was no longer just a cave. It had become a portal, a frozen crossroads between 2 species and 2 timelines. In that darkness, preserved by dust and silence, archaeologists stumbled upon a mystery as vast as time itself. Neanderthals had roamed Eurasia for over 300,000 years. They survived ice ages, hunted mammoths, shaped tools with skill and precision. They buried their dead, cared for their injured, and for millennia, they were the dominant human presence on the continent. And then they were gone. No great war, no towering cataclysm, just a quiet vanishing, replaced by another kind, us, Homo sapiens. Within a few thousand years, Neanderthals disappeared from every valley, every mountain, every forest they once called home. But why? Was it climate? Competition? Disease? Or was it something more intimate and unsettling? Could they have lived alongside us, shared hunting grounds, campfires, even Bloodlines? Once, that idea belonged to science fiction, but now, evidence is mounting. Real, datable, genetic. The line between them and us is beginning to blur. And so, the mystery of their disappearance became more than academic debate. It became the greatest archaeological thriller of our time, a search for answers buried beneath 40,000 years of silence. The deeper they dug into Mondragon, the more the earth revealed its memory, layer by layer, like the chapters of a book, written in soil and ash, 10 distinct strata labeled from A at the surface to J at the very bottom, each one representing thousands of years. And somewhere in the middle, layer E, everything changed. Layer E was dated between 54,000 and 42,000 years ago. It marked a turning point, a moment where the past fractured and something new emerged. The clues were almost microscopic. More than 100 tiny stone points, delicately worked, curved, sharpened to an almost surgical precision. Some were barely the length of a thumb, far too small to be used by hand, too fragile to be thrown, and entirely unfamiliar in Neanderthal toolkits. These weren't the thick flakes or hefty scrapers we associate with our ancient cousins. They were something else, something refined. Archaeologists had never seen anything like them. Not here. Not in this time. And so the question, like the stones themselves, became sharper. Who made these? The answer would send shockwaves through prehistoric research. Because these points weren't Neanderthal, they didn't fit the tools, the time, or the tradition. Instead, they pointed to a far earlier arrival of someone we didn't think had ever set foot here yet. Us, Homo sapiens. They called them Neronian points, named after a cave 70 kilometers north of Mondragon, where the same style had been found. Flint flakes, worked with uncanny precision. The craftsmanship was identical. So was the mystery. At first glance, they looked like tiny blades, but their shape, narrowed tips, subtly curved backs, hinted at something far more advanced, arrowheads, and yet that raised a troubling problem. According to most experts, archery didn't exist in Europe until at least 40,000 years ago, 12,000 years after these points were made. Had history gotten it wrong? To find out, researchers didn't just study. They built. Using replicas of prehistoric tools, they carved a bow from ancient wood and hafted the points onto slender shafts. Then they fired, not into foam, but into bone and hide, meat, straight from a butcher. The results? Undeniable. The flint, shattered bone, clean, deep, deadly. It wasn't a stretch of imagination anymore. It was proof. Microscopic analysis confirmed it. The same impact fractures appeared on the ancient points recovered from layer E. That meant one thing: bow and arrow technology existed over 54,000 years ago. And the people who made them, they weren't Neanderthals. They were Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, with ranged weapons, with long-distance thinking, and with a quiet arrival that would change everything. The flint points had spoken. Someone was here. Someone, unlike the Neanderthals. But who were they? To find answers, archaeologists had to look beyond France, thousands of miles to the east. In a cave near Beirut called Qasr Aqil, researchers uncovered an almost identical toolkit. Same stone points, same craftsmanship, same mystery. Radiocarbon dating placed it all at the same moment in time, 54,000 years ago. The implications? Staggering. It meant Homo sapiens had traveled over 4,000 kilometers from the Levant to the Rhone Valley, armed with bows, with knowledge, and with intention. Long before written history ever acknowledged their presence in Europe. But how did they get here? Did they trek across open plains, through cold valleys and predator-filled forests? Or did they follow the shoreline, boat by boat, along the Mediterranean coast? Evidence from Southeast Asia shows that early humans reached Australia by sea. So the idea of coastal migration, it wasn't fantasy. It was strategy. Either way, one thing was clear. They didn't stumble into Europe. They arrived with purpose. And they didn't vanish quietly, either. The marks they left, on flint, in fire, across DNA, signaled more than survival. They signaled transformation. These were not simple nomads. They were hunters, pioneers, the first wave of a species that would soon reshape the entire continent, and their footsteps are still echoing through the cave at Mondragon. It began with a smell, subtle at first, something the archaeologists could barely name. Not rot, not mold, but a whisper of burned meat. A faint, smoky trace, clinging to the rocks. It shouldn't have been there. And yet, as the team worked deeper into Mondragon's ancient soil, it grew stronger. The source? Stones. Not from the hearth, but from the ceiling, long ago blackened by flame, and later collapsed into the layers below. Their surfaces were coated in soot, not modern, but prehistoric. Sealed by time itself, chemical analysis confirmed the impossible. The charcoal trapped in those ceiling stones was over 50,000 years old. And yet, it still held a scent, a memory of fire, and of the people who fed it. Someone Neanderthal or sapiens had stood beneath that very roof, watching flames curl into the dark. They cooked here, slept here, and left behind not just tools and bones, but atmosphere. And then, one day, they stopped. Why? No one knows. The fire was left to die. The cave fell silent. And for tens of thousands of years, the scent remained, trapped beneath the earth, waiting. It's rare in science to smell the past, to have the ancient world rise, not through sight or touch, but through the most primal sense. But Mondragon? It isn't just an archaeological site. It's a time capsule. You can breathe. And in that lingering smoke lies the haunting truth. What was once alive, once warm, is now only memory, suspended in stone. Beneath the dust and silence of Mondragon, archaeologists turned to chemistry, not for tools, but for time. Using advanced strontium isotope analysis, they examined the trace elements embedded in limestone walls, ash layers, and ancient debris. These isotopes act like geological clocks, capturing when something burned, when something lived, or when something died. Layer by layer, the timeline of the cave began to emerge. And then, something astonishing. The last hearth built by Neanderthals, and the first fire lit by Homo sapiens were separated by just 1 year. Not centuries, not generations. A single orbit of the sun. It was no longer a question of if they met. It was a certainty. 2 species, 2 human worlds, crossing paths in the same cave, breathing the same air, standing beneath the same ceiling, touching the same earth. One species nearing its end, the other just beginning. Was it peaceful? Tense? Indifferent? There's no evidence of violence, no burned bodies, no shattered weapons, but also no signs of fusion, no shared tools, no hybrid camps, just a pause, a handover, as if the cave itself had changed hands, without ceremony, without explanation. It wasn't war. It wasn't friendship. It was something older, something more human. Coexistence on the edge of erasure. And in that fragile overlap, the fate of a species was quietly, irrevocably sealed. The Rhone River winds gently through southern France, a natural vein through a prehistoric landscape. For thousands of years, Neanderthals crossed it freely. It wasn't an obstacle. In the dead of winter, it often froze, walkable, familiar, routine. But after the arrival of Homo sapiens, something changed. Suddenly, Neanderthals stopped crossing. There were no battles, no barricades. The ice still held. The path remained open. And yet, they stayed on one side, as if an invisible wall had been erected, not of stone or snow, but of something far more powerful. Fear, or perhaps understanding. Archaeologists call it a social border, a line not drawn by geography, but by behavior, by perception. Somewhere in the Neanderthal mind, a boundary had formed. They recognized something had shifted, that they were no longer alone. And in response, they pulled back, not because they couldn't cross, but because they chose not to. That silence speaks volumes. No shared campsites, no mingled tools, no evidence of trade or trust. The river hadn't changed, but the world around it had. And just like that, the range of the Neanderthals began to shrink, not all at once, but steadily, like the last light, fading at dusk. Confined to smaller and smaller pockets, they became strangers in lands they once ruled, until finally they were gone, not with a scream, but with a whisper, the quiet consequence of a boundary no one could see, but everyone felt. In 2015, under meters of soil in the cave at Mondragon, a fragment emerged. Not just any bone, but a jaw. Heavy, thick, worn by time, yet miraculously intact. It held 5 teeth, perfectly aligned. Each one, a capsule of deep time. It belonged to a Neanderthal male. Scientists could have cataloged it as just another fossil, another entry in a long, anonymous list of ancient remains. But this one was different. The DNA inside, nearly pristine, untouched by millennia of decay, as if time itself had paused just long enough for us to meet him. They gave him a name, Thorin, not for legend, not for drama, but because names matter. They remind us this was a man, not a species, not a statistic, a person. He had breath, hunger, memories, a voice now lost in the wind. His teeth held more than age. They held radiation signatures, natural isotopes, absorbed through food and water. And by measuring them, scientists placed him in time. Between 43,000 and 48,000 years ago, that made him something rare. A man living at the very edge of his people's story. He wasn't the last Neanderthal, but he was close. And when you hold a tooth like that in your hand, you're not just studying history. You're touching a life, one that stood, walked, perhaps hunted. In the same valley you now survey, Thorin didn't leave behind a monument, but in a single jawbone, he left behind something just as lasting. Proof that they were real, and they were human. When scientists sequenced Thorin's DNA, they expected familiarity, markers that would match other Neanderthals found in central or southern France. But the results were unexpected. Thorin wasn't local. His genetic signature matched Neanderthals from Gibraltar, over 1,000 miles away, a staggering distance for the Ice Age. Yet it told a deeper story. Neanderthals weren't one unified population, spread evenly across Europe. They were clusters, isolated groups, each evolving separately, adapting to different climates, landscapes, and pressures. Some lived in the humid caves of Iberia, others in the frozen steppes of Eastern Europe, and a few, like Thorin, wandered far, perhaps in search of new land, new game, or safety. This discovery shattered the old myth of a single, uniform Neanderthal people. Instead, it revealed a fractured mosaic, tribes scattered across a dying continent. And as Homo sapiens spread, these groups reacted in different ways. Some avoided contact. Some may have interbred. Others got off, dwindling, simply disappeared into dust genetically. They were collapsing. Inbreeding increased. Diversity shrank. Mutation rates rose. They weren't conquered by war, but by numbers, by time, and by entropy. Thorin was not the last, but he was among the final notes in a long, ancient song, one that echoed across Europe for 300,000 years, and ended not with violence, but with quiet isolation. When Thorin walked the earth, Europe looked nothing like it does today. The sea, was 100 meters lower. Rivers ran differently, and vast swaths of land now underwater were once dry, walkable plains. A corridor long forgotten had opened between Gibraltar and southern France. Not a legend, not a myth, a real path carved by wind, stone, and ice. A prehistoric highway stretching north, wide enough for mammoths and for men. That's how the Caves of Mondragon and Gorham's Cave, nearly a continent apart, were once connected. By tundra, by foot, by desperate migration. This was no casual journey. It was survival. Thorin's people likely moved north, chasing game, fleeing encroaching Homo sapiens, or escaping the slow violence of climate. They weren't explorers. They were the last remnants, clinging to territory as the world closed in around them. In this icy corridor, the final chapters of Neanderthal existence played out, fire by fire, step by step, year by brutal year. We often imagine extinction as a singular moment, some dramatic fall, but more often, it's a retreat, a shrinking, a silence that grows too wide to cross. Thorin didn't just die in France. He walked there from the ends of his world. And when he reached the cave at Mondragon, he found more than shelter. He found the edge of time. And beyond it, nothing. For decades, the story was simple. Homo sapiens entered Europe around 42,000 years ago, bringing new tools, new thinking, and inevitably replacing the Neanderthals. It was clean, convenient, the kind of timeline that fit neatly in textbooks. But Mondragon shattered that narrative. The layers in the cave pushed our timeline back, not by a few years, but by 12,000. Sapiens had been here at least 54,000 years ago, armed with bows, with fire, leaving behind blades sharp enough to rewrite history. We didn't just arrive, we coexisted. We stood by Neanderthal fires, watched them cook, work, maybe even mourn, and perhaps we watched them fade. The disappearance of Neanderthals was not a clean break. It was a slow unraveling, a quiet overlap where one species dwindled while the other rose. Mondragon doesn't tell a single story. It tells two, woven into the same soil. One ends, one begins, but neither can be fully understood without the other. And that's the truth we're only now beginning to see. Prehistory wasn't a blank slate, waiting for us to arrive. It was a living world, filled with people, different from us, yet human in their own right. We didn't inherit an empty land. We stepped into a world already full of memory. And with every new layer we uncover, we're forced to ask not just what happened, but what we chose to forget. We believe history is not carved in stone. It is layered, fragmented, still breathing beneath our feet. The Neanderthals didn't simply vanish. They left traces in burned bone, broken flint, and DNA that still runs through some of us today. They shaped tools with purpose, hunted with strategy, cared for their own. They were not primitive. They were people. And when their time came, they didn't fall in battle or vanish in an instant. They were slowly, quietly overwhelmed by numbers, by change, by something we may never fully grasp, but they are not forgotten. Because every fire we reignite in caves like Mondragon is a reminder they were here, and their story still matters. Subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows for cinematic journeys through our ancient past, where DNA becomes destiny and silence becomes story. We don't just tell history, we bring prehistory back to life.